Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome back to another episode on your favorite Little Slaw YouTube channel. So today in this video, we're going to see about the HTML resource load time, and this is the second performance engineering metric that we have to collect in terms of improving the performance engineering. So if you're someone who is into performance engineering, and if you're someone who wants to move to performance engineering, you must definitely know this. You should definitely know this, and this is the HTML resource loading time. So let me give you a quick overview on what is the HTML resource load time. So this HTML resource load time actually refers to the time it takes for all the resources which are linked to an HTML document. It can be an image, it can be a CSS, a JavaScript, a font file, to load the page completely. So the reason why I'm telling this metrics is critical is because in terms of performance engineering, it directly impacts how quickly the web page becomes usable for end users. Say for example, when you're loading a website, when you're loading a web page, so the time it takes, I mean like how quickly the web page takes, or how quickly the web page becomes usable. So when I say usable, it is to view the images, it is to log into the application, or it is to navigate into the page. So this is all or the critical metrics in terms of performance engineering. It's not just the response times, it's also about how quickly a web page becomes usable. So that's very important keyword to remember. So the more quicker the web page becomes usable for end users is what is important factor in terms of performance engineering. So let's now see the next topics, and before we move on to this video, this is me, your son Shanmugam. I welcome you all to our Little Slaw YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't subscribed yet, and please do share the video, like the video, and give your comments and feedbacks in the comment section. And just to give you a note, we're going to talk about various, the training videos in the upcoming weeks. But for now, let's move on to the next part, and where we are going to see the key phases. Before that, yeah, this is another one. So before we see the key phases, I want you all to know why should we or why we have to measure this metric, which is why the HTML resource loading time, or why this metric matters, why is it very important. So there are like four different factors, four different reasons why do we need the metric to be so far we saw about what is the HTML resource loading time, and now we'll see why this particular metric matters. Why is it so important for us to measure these metrics, right? So the reason is the first part, which is user experience. So the faster resource loading ensure a seamless user experience. Say for example, when the page loads very quicker, very faster, which is the user experience will be very seamless. So the longer load time can actually frustrate the users, and it will lead to high bounce rates, which is they might move to another website, another web application. So that's very important. So the faster, the better. And the next thing is the SEO and ranking. Say for example, the search engines like Google. So they actually prioritize the websites with the faster loading times, which will affect the search ranking. So that's another important part. So the more quicker the pages, Google will actually prioritize it. So this is one of the hidden thing, but actually we as a performance engineer must know that. And then the performance bottlenecks. So the slow loading resources actually can block the rendering and delay interactive features. So that is also another important reason why the HTML resource load timing metric is important. And the impact on conversion rates. Say for example, there are like a lot of studies, even from very high research organizations have conducted many studies, and they actually show that even a 1 second delay, just imagine a 1 second delay, which is just a wink of your eye, is even, during load time, can actually significantly impact the user engagement and conversion. So just imagine the wink of your eye can actually the amount of time taken to blink your eye or to make a knock on the door, that takes less than a second, right? So even that delay in load time actually can impact the user engagement and conversion. So when I say conversions, it is actually the amount of business that happens. So just imagine if you are booking an item, and before you do the payment, and if the payment pages is if it takes too much of time, so just imagine, do we really continue booking that particular product or that particular ticket or that particular item in that website? No, right? So that's actually, they're turning down their conversion rates. So these are the factors. This is why this particular metric is very important. And now we'll move on to the next topic. And now we'll see the key phases of HTML resource loading. So when I say the key phases, so these are the 5 or 6 key phases. So if you remember for the TCP, the previous TCP connection over time, if you remember, we had 3 phases. Say for example, the sync request, the sync and acknowledgement, and finally the acknowledgements. Like we were sending, the client sends a request to the server, and that has been identified through a synchronous request, a packet or a message, and then we got the synchronous and acknowledgement, and then we send back the acknowledgement to make sure that we have got the request, the complete response from the server to the client. So the same way here, we have a set of key phases of HTML resource loading, and they are like the DNS resolution, and then we have TCP handshake, we have TLS, SSL handshake, which mainly they say optional, but it is again very critical, I would say, in terms of my experience. And then the initial HTML parsing, and then the resource request and loading, and rendering and execution. So let me explain you all these phases. So starting with the DNS resolution. So when a user enters a URL, the browser must resolve the domain name into an IP address using DNS, and we all know that how the DNS works, the domain naming system. So this process takes time, and that is the first step, the very first step in loading the resources. So that should happen. Without that, the process of the process which I normally say, that is the resolving the domain name. Say for example, when you type google.com, there is no server in the name google.com, right? So there were like many servers with the IP addresses. So when you type the google.com, that will be resolved according to its IP addresses. Say for example, Google must have like more than 1,000 servers or millions of servers with the IP addresses, and they all will be open to you if you are giving the IP as or the URL address as google.com, and that will actually redirect, and that is done by the DNS servers, the domain naming system. So anytime when you type Google, any one of the web server, any one of the Google server will be redirected to you, right? So that's the domain naming system works, and this process should actually take this is the first process, and this actually should take very less time. And then the second part is the TCP handshake. So after the DNS resolution, which is after your process of resolving the domain name to IP address, the second process is the TCP handshake, where the browser, that is your browser, should establish a TCP connection to the server, right? So if you have, for example, Google, so your browser should establish a TCP connection to the server, and this includes the three-way handshake. So which we have discussed in the TCP connection time. And in fact, we'll see a separate video on the connection between the TCP connection time and the HTML resource time. But in this case, yes, the three-way handshake, which is the TCP handshake, which we have seen already, which is the synchronous acknowledgement, and finally the acknowledgement. And then the third step is the TLS SSL handshake. So if the site uses HTTPS, yes, most of the, like all the websites today uses HTTPS. So the browser and the server must negotiate a secure connection before the resource transfer begins. And then the fourth part is initial HTML parsing. So once the browser receives the HTML file, it begins parsing the document. So during this process, the browser encounters linked resources. When I say linked resources, so they are the resources which are linked to your browser, to your web application. So they are like CSS, the JavaScript, or the images, and these get queued for downloading. And then the fifth step, which is resource request and loading, where the browser sends the HTTP request for all the external resources which are identified in the HTML documents, such as the CSS style sheets, the JavaScript files, the images, the fonts, and the video. So these resources are downloaded and loaded in parallel whenever it is possible, but the dependencies may delay the others. When I say dependencies, for example, like the blocking scripts. And then finally the last phase, which is the rendering and execution. So once all the critical resources are loaded, the browser renders the web page and executes any JavaScript, completing the load process. So this is what happens when we try to open a web application, and the key phases of the HTML resource loading. And now we'll move on to the next part, which is the types of resources. What are the types of resources in HTML? So when I say the types of resources, we have two types of resources. Let me take it there. So yeah, there are two types of resources in HTML. So one is the render blocking resources, and then we have the non-blocking resources. So when I talk about the render blocking, so the CSS and JavaScript files that must load and execute before the browser can render the page. So that's why we call it as render blocking resources. And then we have the non-blocking, so the images, videos, and the asynchronous scripts that load in the background without delay rendering. So they are the non-blocking resource. So you must know this. You must know the differences again. What is the difference between the render blocking and the non-blocking, and what comes under the render blocking and what comes under the non-blocking. So just to give you a quick recap. So the CSS and JavaScript files that must load and execute before the browser can render the page. So they are the render blocking because they get executed before the browser can render. And then the non-blocking, which are the images, the videos, and the asynchronous scripts that load in the background without delaying the rendering. So now we'll move on to the next topic. And the next topic, which is the factors affecting the resource load time, which is the HTML resource load time. So the first is the network latency. So the physical distance between the user and the server can increase the load times. Yes, this is a very common a factor that affects sorry for my spelling mistake. It's not affection, it's affecting. So yeah, coming back to this network latency, yes, the physical distance between the user and the server can increase the load times. Yes, this is again a common factor that affects the resource load time or the performance. Even we have discussed the same thing with the TCP connection load time as well. Yes, so the network latency is the very first and the prime factor, and then the second, which is the resource size. So the large images, the unoptimized JavaScript or the bulky CSS files take longer to download. So if you are seeing an application where you get to see a poor response times, so yes, these could be the reason, which is large images, unoptimized JavaScript or bulky CSS files, which will take longer time to download. And then the third one, which is the resource prioritization. So the browser prioritizes certain resources like CSS or even others. So improper prioritization can delay the critical resources. And then the fourth part, which is the caching. So the resources cached locally or on a content delivery network will get load faster. So that's another part, which is the caching, and we all know how important caching is in terms of the performance of the application. And then the final one, which is the third-party resources. So the resources which are hosted on external services, like for example, like analytics scripts or ads, can introduce the delay. So these are the third-party resources. And now I will move on to the next part, where we measure the HTML resource loading time. I mean, like, what are the measures? How will we measure the load time? So previously we saw, for the previous metric, so we saw that we have to use tools and then we have to use the APM. But here we have one more thing, which is the using the browser developer tool. So we normally know the pressing of the F12 button, which will take us to the network tab in the browser's developer tools. Yes, and then we can reload the page to see the load time of each resources along with their size and type. So I'll just show you at the end of this video how to do that. And then the performance testing tools, so like we all know, but this time it's not the tools like JMeter or NeoLoad or LoadRunner. This time it is tools like Google Lighthouse, the web page test, or GT metrics. They can provide detailed reports on resource loading. Yes, we're going to see that as well in some of after at the end of this video. We'll see how to do that using the Google Lighthouse, which is the inbuilt one for Chrome or for any other browsers. And then we have the web page test. We are going to see that. And then the APM tools. Yes, always they help us to get these data. So tools like Dynatrace or New Relic, which will help us to track the resource load time in the production environments. And now we'll move on to the next topic, which is the optimizing of the HTML resource load time. Yes, so far we saw about what are the factors and why do we get high response time. So now we'll see how to optimize the HTML resource load time. So the first factor of it is the minimizing the resource sizes. So we have to compress the images using the modern formats, like for example WebP, which will help us to compress the image. And then we have to minify the CSS. So for example, we have a very big CSS file which has a lot of kilobytes and even up to megabytes. You have to know how to minify it, and then you have to use JavaScript files to reduce their size. And then the second part is the enable the browser caching. So where you have to set the caching headers for static resources, so that, yeah, we all know static resources are going to be the same one, they're not going to change. So you have to enable the browser caching to set the caching headers for static resources, so that the users don't need to re-download them on subsequent visits. Say for example, if you are visiting for the first time, yes, it will automatically take a lot of time because there won't be anything in the cache, so it will take a lot of time for you to download them and then keep them. But once you download them, the very next time when you are downloading it, automatically it takes from the static location or from the cache, so it will be very quicker. And then the third part is using the CDN, the content delivery networks. So you have to distribute as an architecture or as a performance engineer, you must give the architecture solution to distribute the resources across multiple servers worldwide to reduce the latency. And then the fourth part, which is the prioritizing of critical resources. So you have to like the inline critical CSS to render above the fold content faster. So that's another way to prioritize the critical resources. So where you are going to prioritize, so which should be more critical, so you're going to send that first, and then you can actually defer, you can even asynchronously load the non-essential JavaScript. And then the fifth part, which is the optimizing of server performance. So you can use gzip or broti compression, and you can even reduce the server response times. And then you know about the very common topic, the lazy loading. Yes, so you can load the images and videos only when they come into the user's viewpoint. So for example, if you are in a web page and like once you scroll down or you scroll up or to the left or right, only when they move, only when the users are or only the web page is in that particular viewpoint, you can enable that. So this will actually help you to prioritize what is going to be the high priority one. So you can prioritize that, so the web page will be usable, it will be very quicker in terms of users viewpoint. And then finally, the limiting of third-party scripts. Yes, you have to reduce or you have to optimize the third-party scripts like analytics or social sharing plugins like the Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So you can actually limit those. So that will actually even optimize your HTML resource loading time. And then finally, the best practices. So let's now see what are the best practices in terms of DevOps related topic. So let me just quickly fix this part. So yeah, the best practices, when I talk about the best practices, so the first thing is which is the continuous monitoring, where we have to integrate the monitoring tools into our DevOps pipelines to track the resource load time in real time. And then the second part, which is automated testing, where we have to use automated tests to detect the regressions in resource load times during deployment. And then the performance budgeting, where we have to set the performance thresholds for resources and fail builds if these thresholds are exceeded. So finally, let me take you through a quick example. I just want to give you an example workflow, which starts with analyzing the load times using developer tools. And then once you analyze that, you have to identify what are all the largest or the slowest loading resources, and then you have to optimize the resources. Say for example, like you have to compress the images, or you have to work on the lazy loading of non-critical content. And then you have to implement the CDNs, the content delivery networks, and any of the caching strategies that will help you to improve the performance. And finally, you have to test the optimized version using the performance testing tool. So this is the way. So just if you follow these 5 steps, you can definitely improve the performance. So first thing is you have to analyze the loading time using developer tools. Second thing is you have to identify the largest or the slowest loading resources. Third is you have to optimize those resources which you have identified, which takes largest or slowest loading time. And then you have to implement CDNs and caching strategies based on the requirement. It's not just if you implement CDNs or caching strategies that will improve the performance, but it depends on what is your bottleneck. And the final point is you have to test the optimized version using tools. So overall, just quick conclusion. So the HTML resource loading time is a very, very critical metric because it directly affects the user experience. Like I told you, the more quicker the page gets usable. But if it's not usable, yes, it does not matter how quicker your page is. It will even increase the search rankings in the Google as well and the application's performance. So by understanding and optimizing this particular metric, which is the HTML resource loading time metric, we can deliver a faster, more efficient web applications and websites, which will ensure a satisfied users and business success. So until I meet you in the next video, it's bye bye. Frozen Shanmugam and your favorite Little Star YouTube channel. Take care and bye bye.